We are on operations on decimals. So we're skipping to chapter 5. We did part of chapter 4 with fractions. Now we're going to do part of chapter 5 about decimals. We'll get to the rest of chapter 4 and the rest of chapter 5 later. Right now we're just going to focus on all the operations with decimals. So we'll go over just basic decimals and then adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing decimals. So decimals are another way of writing fractions. And there are some common fractions that we probably already know the decimal to. So this one, 1/2, most of us know that that is 0.5. That's another way of writing 1/2 is with the decimal 0.5. When you make your decimal points, make them big and obvious so that you can see them. If you just kind of put a dot, we can't always see that. So always make your decimals very clear, just like with your negatives. You make it very clear if you're working with negatives. Make it very clear if you're working with decimals. So 3/4, we might know the decimal is 0.75. And 1/4, we might know the decimal is 0.25. We'll learn how to actually do this later. I just want to see if you guys can remember just some common fraction to decimal comparisons. So decimals are going to follow their own set of rules, and we can always convert from fraction back to decimal and decimal to fraction. So place value for decimals. So now we're going to have this decimal point in the middle to separate what we call the whole numbers from the parts of numbers, or from decimals. So on the on the left-hand side of the decimal point, we know that that is the ones place. The next is the tens place, and then the hundreds place. Those are the place values we learned at the beginning of the course. On the right-hand side of the decimal point, we start with what's called the tenths place, and we add a th. Tenths. It's hard to hear sometimes, but there's a th in there, and that is because all of these decimals are out of 10. Then we have the hundredths place, again with that th. You might want to underline that th sound. Hundredths. And that's because everything in the second place is out of 100. Then we have the thousandths place, again with that th, because everything here is out of 1,000. And it's kind of a mirror image of the place values that go higher and higher. These values are getting smaller and smaller in the same way. So the fourth decimal place is called the 10,000ths place, again with that th. The fifth one is the 100,000ths place. So the 1,000ths, the 10,000ths, the 100,000ths, that's hard to say. And then the next place would be the 1,000,000ths with a th. That's kind of funny looking. 1,000,000ths place, and it just continues. Every time we're dividing by a bigger and bigger number. So that's 1 out of 10,000, 1 out of 100,000, and 1 out of 1,000,000. That is a very small number. 1 out of 1,000,000. So as the place values move to the right, they get smaller and smaller and smaller by a factor of 10. We're adding a 0 each time as to what we're dividing by, which makes our values smaller and smaller. So that's place value for the decimals, and that's in section 5.1. And so similar to what we did for integers, we're going to identify the place values for the underlined digit in decimal form. So this 4 would be in the hundredths place. This 3 would be the third place over is the thousandths. It's hard to hear, but there's a th in there. And this 4 is in the first decimal place, which is the tenths. And that's way over there. 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth place. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth place is the 100,000ths with the th again. So you'll have some just identify the place values for decimals, and it just goes backwards from the whole numbers. All right, now let's write these decimals in words. So write these numbers in words. This time we're going to use the word and. When we were just dealing with integers, we never used the word and. We saved the word and for the decimal point. And this is going to sound a little funny at first, but this is the technically correct way to say each one of these. And before I start, I'm going to kind of section these off so my words don't run together. Might want to do the same. I meant to put lines in there. So draw one more line. There we go. Alright, so the first one is going to sound a little funny. 4 and, the and represents the actual decimal point. 4 and 8 tenths. That is the mathematically correct way to say that. 4 and 8 tenths. Now we usually just say 4.8, but that is not the technically correct way to say it. Here we're going to have 12 and, so we specifically use the word and, 1, and the 1 is in the thousandths place. So 12 and 1 thousandth, all those THs. 0.2, we can say 0 and 2 tenths. I don't remember if the computer actually says 0 and, or you can just kind of say 2 tenths if there's no number in front. But 0 and 2 tenths is very clear that there's nothing in front of the decimal point. This would be 0 and 2, but this time the 2 is in the hundredths place. And this would be 0 and 2. This time the 2 is in the thousandths place. So you specify the place value at the end, kind of like we do for integers. Alright, not too bad. Sounds a little funny, but not too bad. Same idea going from words to decimals. 6 and 7 tenths. 6 and, we had to wait before we write it. 7 tenths. The tenths is the first place, so that's where we put our 7. 32 hundredths. This is a little tricky. Hundredths is 2 places, so I suggest starting by identifying the 2 places. 32 is a 2-digit number, so it fits right on the 2 spaces. Sometimes you're going to have more spaces than you do digits, and I'll show you what to do then, like this next one. 32, but this time it says thousandths. Thousandths is 1, 2, 3 decimal places, so you have to set that up first. 1, 2, 3. And 32 has to, let me say this right, has to fit at the end of the places. So you have to justify to the right, get the number all the way to the right. Any empty space before the decimal place, you put a 0. So it's 0.032. So these can be a little tricky. The next one, 428,000, that should have said thousandths. Sorry about that. Thousandths, add that TH on there. 428 thousandths. So again, we have 1, 2, 3 decimal places. But it's 428, which is 3 numbers, so you just fit it right on to the spaces. So you have to be a little bit careful, justify to the right, which is kind of awkward for us. And then anytime there's an empty space before the decimal point, or between your number and the decimal point, you put a 0. So just be a little careful on those. Another way this book just, again, goes over place value for decimals is by giving you random digits with random place values out of order, which is kind of frustrating sometimes. They're random digits in a random order, and we have to kind of piece them together in the right order. So you have to read it a couple times sometimes. It says 0 ones, 5 hundredths, 1 10, 4 hundreds, and 2 tenths. So a couple different ways to do this. I kind of go through and find the highest place value I can. So hundreds is the highest. So I start with that. And then I think, are there any tens? There's 1 10. Are there any ones? It says 0 ones. Then I know my decimal point goes next. Then tenths. And then hundredths. So if any of them are skipped, you put zeros. Sometimes it'll specify that. But if any of them get skipped, you do have to put zeros. Let me draw a line again so we don't get confused. So same idea with the next one, and I think I put one more on there. It's kind of funky. You kind of have to shuffle the numbers around. It makes me think of Price is Right, where they kind of shuffle the digits around to make different prices. It's kind of that same idea. Kind of have to shuffle those numbers around until you figure out where they go. So the next one says 7 tens, 9 tenths, 3 ones, 6 hundredths, and 8 hundreds. So the 8's going to go first. Tens, ones, tenths, and then hundredths. So just take your time through these. It's not a quick process. Just really be careful. Again, if they skip a place, you'll have to put a 0 in there. And the last one here, we have 3 thousands, 4 hundredths, 6 ones, 2 10,000ths, and 5 tenths. So we have the thousands place. I don't see a hundreds place, so I'm going to put a 0. I don't see a tens place, so I'm going to put another 0. There's a ones place. There's a tenths. There's a hundredths. There's not a thousandth, so I'm going to put a 0, but then there's a 10,000ths, so a 2. So that one's tricky. You have to add those zeros in there. If a place value gets skipped, add those zeros in there. So take your time on both of these, writing in digits both ways. Just really take your time. It's not a difficult procedure, but sometimes it's a little aggravating. All right, and at the bottom of section 5.1, we have write the decimal as a fraction in lowest terms. This is kind of going back with what we did in chapter 4 with lowest terms. The way to do this is to identify the place value and divide it by the number of that place value. So the 7 is in the tenths place, so we put the 7 over 10, and then you just check to see if that's lowest terms. For this one, that is lowest terms. Here, the 5 is in the tenths place, so it's 5 over 10, and that can reduce to 1 over 2. The 8 is in the tenths place, so it's 8 over 10, and that can reduce to 4 over 5. So it's again mixing our fractions and decimal knowledge. 0.28, the 8 is in the hundredths place, so it's going to be 28 out of 100. Just to help you out, the number of decimal places you have is the number of zeros you put on the bottom. So 1 decimal place, 1 0. 2 decimal places, 2 zeros. So it helps you determine the number of zeros to put. This can reduce. I know I can divide them both by 2. And then I can divide by 2 again and get 7 over 25. So you just keep reducing until you cannot divide any further. 66, again 2 decimal places, so you'll have 2 zeros on the bottom. That reduces to 33 out of 50. And finally, 0.75 is 75 out of 100. I'm going to do this the short way. I know they both divide by 25, and that takes me right to 3/4. So you can go more slowly and divide by 5 a couple times, but I know they both divide by 25. 25. I also already know that 0.75 is 3/4. So just converting from a decimal to a fraction and then getting that fraction into lowest terms. So that is section 5.1. Let's keep going to rounding decimals. And this will be very familiar to how we rounded back in chapter 1. Oops. So rounding decimals, do not move the decimal point when rounding. The book mentions that. I've never had any situation where a student moved the decimal point. Keep it where it is. And the same rules apply that we learned in chapter 1. And that is underline. Let's review those. Underline the place you're rounding to. And you look to the right. And then you make your decision. You either round up or stay. Up or stay. And then this time, instead of changing everything to zeros, you just drop off everything after where you're rounding. So you underline the place you're rounding to, look to the right and make your decision, up or stay. After that, you just drop off anything else. It's kind of nice. You don't have to add zeros or anything. So let's practice that. Rounding to the nearest tenth. So underline the tenths place. We look immediately to the right, which would be the 4. The 9 and the 6 don't matter. And we'd have 5 point. The 4 tells us to keep the 3 the same, 5.3. You can just drop off the rest. So you can just stop at the place you're rounding. And it's a little easier maybe than with integers. Again, the tenths place is all we care about, so I look exactly at the 9. I ignore all of those. It's going to be 14 point. The 9 tells me to round the 3 up, so it'll be 14.4. And I don't have to write anything else. Just done. 10.7, I'm going to underline the 7, look at the 0. Those numbers don't matter. And that's going to be 10 point. The 0 tells me not to change the number, so it just stays as 7. This is rounding. There is a symbol that we might use, and it's a squiggly equal sign. And what that means is approximately equal to. I don't think I used that before. So that's kind of the symbol that indicates I'm rounding. So, whoops. Instead of a straight equal sign, we use kind of a squiggly equal sign to show that we've been rounding off our numbers. Alright, let's try it again with the nearest hundredth. That's the second place, so I'm going to underline the second place, look immediately to the right, and ignore the rest. So I have 0.0. The 8 tells me to change the 1 to a 2. And then again, you can drop off anything after the place where you're rounding. 5.89, so the 9, use the 0, ignore the 3. 5.8, the 9, the 0 tells me to keep the 9 the same. That's my answer there. And then here, I'm going to underline the 9, look at the 7. The 7 tells me to round up. So the 9 becomes a 10, and this is when you have 0 point, you actually change that to 70. But again, you're going to put that 0 because I need both of those decimal places. So it seems a little weird to add that 0, but if I'm rounding to 2 decimal places, each answer needs to have 2 decimal places. For thousandth, that's the third decimal place. 1, 2, 3, look immediately to the right. That would be the 5. The 5 tells me to round the 6 up. Everything else stays the same, 14.39. The 6 is going to become a 7, and I stop there, so thousandth is 3. And I should have 1, 2, 3 decimal places in my answer. 1, 2, 3. Look at the 9. The 9 tells me to round up, so it's 0.33. The 4 becomes a 5. Remember, if I'm going too fast, just pause and start back over. And then 8.008, the 5 tells me to round up, so it's going to be 8.009. So if I'm rounding to the 10th, my answer should have 1 decimal place. If I'm rounding to the 100th, my answer should have 2. 1000th, my answer should have 3. The other type of rounding in this section is for money. So we're rounding with money. So we're going to think money for these. There's a couple problems that tell you to round to the nearest dollar. Well, dollar is really the ones place. So we're going to round to the ones place. Again, same rule. Look at the number immediately next to it. And this will round $48.69. Round it off to the nearest dollar. It's $49. I don't know if you need to put the .00 or just 49. But the 6 tells us to change the 8 to a 9. Again, we're going to round to the nearest dollar, so I look at the last digit before the decimal and the number right after the decimal. That's going to tell me to round to 594, leave the 4 the same. 399.88. Sorry, we're rounding to the 9, looking at the first 8, and that rounds to 400. You might not need to get that specific with it. Anything over 50 cents, you round up. Anything less than 50 cents, you round down. That's a little bit easier, maybe, to think about. And then this one is to round to the nearest cent, and that's 2 decimal places, so the hundredths place. 12.342, so the 4, looking at the 2. So that's going to round to $12.34. 14.595. So the 5 tells us to round the 9 up. Well, 9 up rounds to 10. This is $14.60. Again, you need that second decimal place. Partially because we're talking money, also because we're rounding to the hundredths place and we need both numbers. And then finally, the 6, looking at that, it's $578.07. So it's important to make sure that you're rounding to the correct place value. All right, I'm going to pause there, and then we will continue in just a minute.